Is everyone awake? Everyone still asleep? No? Okay. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Iqbal. I will be your moderator for this event. I am so excited to see all of you here. We're about to have a really great talk, a really great discussion. We were having teaser sessions in the back just now. But before I begin, what we're going to be discussing today, the official title is ASEAN Navigating Through a Turbulent World That's Increasingly Polarized. But what we really wanted to focus on is the US-China trade war, their rivalry, and the impact that that will have on us regionally as well as domestically. I will need a lot of help to make this discussion as relevant and interesting as possible. So there will be a Q&A at the end. So if any of our panelists say anything particularly interesting or insightful and you want to follow up on that, please take the opportunity to do so during the Q&A. Before I hand the floor over to you guys, I did want to hold a poll of our audience here just so that you guys kind of know who you're talking to. Ladies and gentlemen, earlier this year, the ICS Yusof Ishak Institute in Singapore conducted a State of the Southeast Asia survey in which they asked respondents across ASEAN what they thought about this issue specifically. And the question they asked the respondents was, if it came down to it, if we were forced to choose sides, and we were forced to choose sides between the US and China, which side should we go with? And I'm gonna ask you guys to put up your hands, but I know if I say, if you guys vote for US, put up your hands, I know some today. So again, raise your hands if you think that we should ally with the US in the upcoming rivalry. Raise your hands and leave your hands down if you vote China. Raise them higher. I really can't see. I feel like I need to introduce some robustness to this methodology. Let's do the flip side then. If you vote China, put your hands up, and then if you vote the US, leave your hands down. Whoa! Well, I guess we know who our new masters are. The study that was conducted and published in February found that 61% of the respondents said that if it came down to it, they would vote, they would prefer to ally with the US versus 39% at the time said they would prefer to ally with China. Panelists, can you share some insights about that? What do you think off the top of your head about that, and what do you think we saw right here, right now?
Okay, I'll try to give my opinion. First of all, the question is a wrong one. Sorry, no offense. It's a wrong one because this concept of taking sides should not be in our minds. We should take an autonomous approach. Therefore, there's no need to take sides. We project our own decision on why we don't want to ally with anyone. So that, I will say something about this later, but that's my answer. Wrong question.
Great. Thoughts, Professor Jomo?
I'm not sure whether it's useful to go on about a poll taken by some Singaporeans. You know, we don't even know who was polled, and you know, I think the real challenge for us in Malaysia today is to look at what would be useful for us. And if you think about what happened half a century ago, there was a decision made by the foreign ministers and then subsequently by the heads of government in ASEAN, at that time it was just 5 members, to declare Southeast Asia as a zone of peace, freedom, and neutrality. I think that declaration half a century ago is still very relevant, but it needs to be interpreted in our times. Before that, there were two very important developments. In 1955, there was a meeting of the new emerging forces. Malaya was a colony. Sarawak was a post-fiefdom colony, and Sarawak was a part of a chartered company. Sorry, the other way around. Sabah was through the North Borneo chartered company. The point really is that at that time, there was a commitment mainly of Asian countries, but also including African countries. And the only independent African country at that time was Ethiopia. Ethiopia with the Emperor Haile Selassie. Every other country was a colony. So the representation in that conference was limited to a number of states which had achieved independence. Notably, I think everybody knows that Jawaharlal Nehru came from India and Zhou Enlai came from China. Now, I think the commitments made at Bandung, historic Bandung conference, are still very relevant for us today. And subsequently in 1961, as Tito, the leader of Yugoslavia, an entity which no longer exists, tried to break away from the Soviet leadership, he joined countries in Africa and Asia, including the Arab world. Gamal Abdel Nasser was also very prominent, and they formed the non-aligned movement. Malaysia hosted the non-aligned movement conference a few years ago, and remains in the non-aligned movement. I think today non-alignment is very, very relevant, especially in dealing with the world. So for the slightly different reasons as Dr. Munirah, I would argue that non-alignment is the best option, but for reasons which are very different. We have a situation in the world today where it is not ideological differences or pretensions of ideological differences. Let's face it, the only show in the world today is the capitalist show. Okay, so we have varieties of capitalism. It's not a choice between capitalism versus communism or anything like that. But nonetheless, we have a situation since about a decade ago where you've had President Obama declaring his so-called pivot to Asia, and in a sense, sending out the salvo of the first salvo of the new Cold War. So the new Cold War is very different. It needs us to analyze it very differently. But we are a very open economy. Our deputy minister here knows very well, as you know, and we are a very open economy, and it would be cutting off our nose to spite our face to take sides in this conflict.
I guess
so non-alignment is what we need to do.
Pass the stage to Chin Tong. Can you then take this question from your perspective? Like, what is your top line thoughts about this subject?
I think we are entering into a new phase of world history. There was a period of time from around the 1980s, particularly after the fall of Berlin Wall in 1989, up until COVID. There was a common characteristic of that period of time. Neoliberalism, financializations of everything from housing to healthcare to everything. But there is a pushback. The pushback comes in multiple forms. We suddenly realize that there's something called pandemic. We suddenly realize that there's something called climate change. We suddenly realize that there's still war, and not one but multiple wars happening in front of us. in very prominent places, and which will have huge consequences. And we also realize that the financial system is very unstable. So the world moved from a period of time that people believed that the structure was more or less US dominant after the end of the Cold War, to one that is very different now. In terms of trade, there was a period of time where most people held the view that just in time was the rule of the game. Today, just in case is the rule of the game. And in terms of geopolitics, we will have to accept that in the years to come, the US-China rivalry and geopolitics in general will be a very important part of the economy. For the longest of time, at least for 20, 30, 40 years, mainstream economics tries to impress upon us that there's no politics in economic consideration. Not local politics, not geopolitics. But I think what we have to learn now, or unlearn now, is that politics and geopolitics is at the heart of economics. And with that mindset, we will have to weigh all our options. For Malaysia and for Indonesia particularly, traditionally we have a non-aligned posture, and we should continue that. We should be the pillar so that eventually ASEAN can be as much as possible in the middle as much as possible. And that middle has to be a strength and not a weakness. In a divided world, if the middle is reasonably strong, then we become a location for transaction. We become a space for mediation. We become a space for mutual exchanges that cannot happen elsewhere in a divided world. So that, as Prof. Jomo pointed out, that non-aligned posture and position should be our strength.
Eden, I want to pass the floor to you. Can you speak a bit about values and ideas? And since the 9 alignment has been spoken quite a bit about right now, what would a non-aligned movement in this century look like? Would it simply be non-committance to any sort of idea, or would it actually come with a different sort of perspective of what the global order should be?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question, but I don't think we know. And my main concern is whether we have enough of intellectual prowess to try and know. I think we had this brief conversation, but I'm very interested in the question, and I'm very taken. It was quite a dramatic scene to see so many people put up their hands and say China. And I think I'm enough of that age to remember that at one time the Malaysian passport contained, as the first country you were barred from visiting was China. Albania was, because alphabetical, is it? Alphabetical, okay. Albania, China, Cuba, Vietnam, Israel, it goes on. And today we have this scenario, and at one time China was, despite Malaysia being perhaps the first Southeast Asian country to establish diplomatic relations with China, with Tun Razak's visit to see Chairman Mao in 1974, China was very much the specter in also kind of defining the contours of our local politics in many ways. But I'm glad that Prof spoke of Southeast Asia and reminded the Youth Economic Forum, because I don't know how much the Youth Economic Forum actually knows or remembers things like the Cold War, or neutrality, or Bandung, at a very, very crucial time in which we need to know. And memory needs to play a very important role in the decisions that we make. So that kind of literacy, that kind of intellectual depth is so incredibly important in this age of real forgetfulness and everything contained in 124 characters. Yeah. So I think polls like that are conducted all the time and very often conducted and put across as representative by a profession, my profession, that is becoming increasingly shameful in its conduct these days, the media and journalism. But I think we are living in a time of, if I may refer to Marx, because these days they are seizing books on Marx from the bookstores. But I think we are living through a time of implosions. We have to recognize that the United States, militarily, economically, whatever, is still so much at the prime, but there are indications that it is a declining power. You know, this is primordial. This is age-old. As older kings die and younger kings rise, so you will get that kind of tension and that kind of conflict. But I think Malaysia has to pay great attention, and our Prime Minister reiterated it again. He talked about neutrality at the United Nations. But I'd like to get a sense of what neutrality actually means these days. Our region is the birthplace of neutrality. But geopolitics defines so many things, including which side in the Cambodian conflict most countries had to. And I remember Tun Hussein On, basically having to side with the Khmer Rouge and doing so with tears in his eyes. Yeah. So I think those things in this new world order, it's quite interesting. I agree with YB, it's a new world order, but so many of the tensions and so many of the power struggles remain the same. And I suppose what we need to urge ourselves to do is really to position ourselves and ask very critical questions about what neutrality actually means. And then history becomes very important. This is one question that Malaysians should always ask themselves from the time of Malacca, and it's just been kind of reincarnated in various ways. How does a country of today 33 million people, but at independence maybe about 15, 16 million people, how were we able to punch above our weight for so long, so well? That's the question I think we need to ask ourselves in the shadow of the polarities that you posed.
I guess I want to switch back to Dr. Munirah, and Eden was talking about stuff with regard to non-alignment and positioning ourselves in this new world. Given that the world is shifting, a lot of the current ways we think about these issues still remain the same. How do we approach this in a novel way?
Okay, you know, at the beginning of your introduction, we were referring to the theme being US-China rivalry. I rather stay away from that, not because I don't think it's an important issue. I would like to stray a little bit from the ongoing paradigm of conflict between two big powers. Now, here's the reason. My field, my academic field, which is international relations and strategic studies, basically we all over the world and including in the global south, we follow a Western theoretical paradigm, which is basically grounded in conflict. Now, let me just bear with me. I need to explain the reasons I am using Western versus non-Western. The theme of this seminar is basically global agenda, navigating through turbulence and increasing polarized world. All right, that's the theme. Some of the questions that were asked by the moderator when we were talking earlier is basically about US-China relations and mainstream IR theory. But my question that I want to ask all of you is, do these themes actually reflect everything we are discussing about in geopolitics today, they reflect only a portion of regional and world concerns. We are not, our whole life when we wake up in the morning and go to sleep at night is not just about US-China or rivalry. It suggests a preoccupation with this idea of hegemonic power, all right? It suggests a way of thinking which is essentialist, and a way of thinking which I called binary thinking, okay? In keeping with the spirit of next year's UN Summit of the Future, 2024, in keeping with this spirit, I would like to suggest an alternative way to study, to research, and to discuss international affairs. Just, as I said, bear with me that I am straying from what all of you might consider reality, okay? But to me, I think we are forgetting what the reality is. And to know, to come back to what reality really is, we must think about the actual academic discipline of IR, all right? How do we rethink international relations or international affairs? And is this question relevant? Rethinking it. It is relevant because since 1919, when the discipline emerged officially at a university in Aberystwyth, we still face wars, we still face destruction, we still face power contestations, we still feel threatened, we still spend loads of money building warships. We claim that we had a period of a long peace called during the Cold War, but that's a euphemism. Was it a long, it may be long, but was it peaceful? Just because there wasn't any nuclear war. We forget about other parts of the world, which is outside the West, which were embroiled in consistent, devastating, constant wars. People were still dying. People were still going through civil wars. So what is the peace about during the Cold War? So we need to transform what we teach, what we research. Transform or rethink about what we prioritize as global problems. Yes, US-China rivalry is a global problem, but are we also neglecting other regional problems? I will come to that afterwards. Research and teaching themes in places like Southeast Asia or countries like Malaysia, small powers and middle powers as well. What are relevant areas to research that are relevant to our societies, to our communities, not just the state? Shouldn't we incorporate other approaches to looking at world order? Instead of prioritizing the object of our study, which is the state, which is what IR does, basically. We tend to neglect sub-state actors. We tend to neglect what is society. Society is actually you and me. It's people, it's human beings. We neglect how humans are feeling in this thing we call world order. How humans are suffering in this thing we call world order. Incidentally, Edin, yeah, we have to watch ourselves when we say the word Marxist, right? But do you realize we celebrate May 1st, right? Labor Day? How can we detach Marxism and socialism from May Day? We have an official holiday. We take the day off, we don't work, we enjoy ourselves. And yet, we are supposed to hide the fact that we have Marxist books and articles. So, I mean, this is again, what Edin spoke about. We lack intellectual depth. Now, what I've been just been trying to stray your minds away from is actually towards looking at world order in this aspect. We may have a new world order. It's new in certain parts, but the fact is it's still an old world order in terms of it's characterized by hegemonic orientations. There is one dominant and the rest are subordinate. There is always a contestation for the dominant to subjugate others. The North versus the South. The concept of allies, of alliances. Why, you know, the question that you asked, Mr. Moderator, we need to take sides, meaning choose an ally. But we have survived in the region without subjecting ourselves to the system of alliance. So can't that be the new future? And as a very famous IR scholar who started this way of thinking, which by the way is called decolonizing IR, Amitav Acharya suggested instead of focusing on polarity, which implies hierarchy in the world system, instead of focusing on polarity, think of world order as your cinema theater. There are many complexes. So it's a multiplex system as opposed to a polar system.
Can I riff off of that?
Sure.
So I guess as we're shifting our as we're shifting our view of the global order in terms of a dual sort of hegemonic system to something that's more democratic, so to speak. Chin Tong, is there a way we can view this, the global order, as not necessarily a zero-sum game, but something like a rising tide lifts all boats sort of situation? Does it have to mean that someone has to be a loser and someone has to be a winner? Why can't it mean everyone wins?
I try to use three middle in order to explain where Malaysia should position ourselves and how it's relevant to these generations who are sitting in front of us, and what are the relevance to the next 10, 15 years. The first middle is how to position Malaysia as an aspiring middle power. The Defense White Paper of 2019 put this idea at the center, that Malaysia has always tried to punch above our weight globally in global affairs. And we should see ourselves as an aspiring middle power, even if we are not yet there. And that is important because as we talk about neutrality, we talk about where we position ourselves, Professor Kwek Ching Tree's idea of active neutrality comes into mind. We should see ourselves as an aspiring middle power, and we actively participate to shape global affairs with active neutrality. The second middle is our position in the global supply chain and our position in Southeast Asian supply chain. We are seeing major shift in supply chain. The previous supply chain was just in time. And previously, from around 2001, when China joined WTO, up to about 2017, when Trump was installed as the President of the United States, there was that period of time where China was the global factory, and it was the only global factory. Malaysia experienced our first economic takeoff between 1988 to 1997. By 1997, there was Asian financial crisis. 1998, Anwar was sacked as Deputy Prime Minister. It sets off a series of political challenges, and China joined WTO in 2001. What was the consequence? The consequence was Malaysia has experienced a very long period of premature deindustrialization. But things are shifting now. We are seeing, of course, home shoring, moving away from China, but moving back to the United States, moving back to Japan, moving back to Korea. We have seen nearshoring, moving to Mexico, moving to Poland. We are also seeing a shift to Southeast Asia. How is Malaysia positioning ourselves in this whole thing? There are many people in this country that keep on telling us that we are competing with Vietnam and Indonesia, which I don't subscribe to. The moment you look into the supply chain in Southeast Asia, we acknowledge that Singapore is the financial hub. We also acknowledge that Indonesia, the Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam has population and demographic dividend, which we do not have. But essentially, Malaysia can do anything that Singapore can do, maybe with a bit of inefficiency. But not much, not much. Actually, whatever Singapore can do, Malaysia can do. Except that you have to pay 2/3 of Singapore pay. Okay, you pay 2/3 of Singapore pay, you can get any talent. I keep on telling people, there's no talent problem in Malaysia. There's only a pay problem. But once we position ourselves as the indispensable middle in Southeast Asia, Singapore has an English common law system. Singapore has good logistics. We have good logistics. Singapore doesn't have land. We have land. But we are not competing with Singapore. We're not competing with Indonesia. Because in this global shift, none of us can take the load of what was in China. We will have to work with each other, maybe in a form of vertical integration. That we accept that there are differences, but we work together because the pie is too big. And I move to the third middle class. When China joined WTO, China had only about 100 million middle class. Today, China has 400 million middle class. Southeast Asia has less than 100 million middle class. We have 650 million population. But imagine this. Imagine that each of the flow of investment that comes into Southeast Asia can also create domestic linkages. And this requires government policy. This requires government policy. This requires societal consensus. This required businesses to play ball. Like each of the investment that comes into this country. Let's say we think about domestic linkages, regional linkages. How do we actually create a resilient supply chain where many SMEs in Malaysia take part in the supply chain? How do we ensure that jobs that come, or investment that comes into Malaysia and comes into Indonesia generate well-paying jobs? Now, if we can do that in Malaysia, and if we can do that as a region, whether it's the entire ASEAN or selected group of ASEAN countries, pushing wages up, then we will see a middle class in 5, 10, 15 years in Southeast Asia, in Malaysia and in Southeast Asia. Now, when let's say in 15 years' time, Southeast Asia has 300 million middle class. However you define it, Southeast Asia would not just be a production site. It is also a consumer site. It's a market. So if we think in this way, I think we'll have to position ourselves to think in this three middle in order to shape both our posturing, geopolitical posturing, our place in the supply chain, and our destiny, creating a middle-class society in Malaysia and in Southeast Asia.
Professor Jomo, you've written before that ASEAN has often been hailed as an exemplar of regional cooperation, but its contributions have actually been limited in scope. jumping off of what Chin Tong was just saying about China's too big. Whatever leftovers we get from them, we won't be able to eat all by ourselves. So in terms of just splitting the pie equitably, and you've written about income inequality before, can you speak a bit about how ASEAN should approach this problem in terms of the opportunities or the chances that are going to be coming our way with regard to this evolving world?
I think it's important for us to recognize that we live in a world where we actually have many different states in ASEAN. To generalize about ASEAN, I think is not very helpful. I think what we need to do is to be very pragmatic. I think some of the changes which Chin Tong just described are actually very important. We have a situation where there is a real possibility that there will be some displacement of industrial opportunities into Southeast Asia, and Malaysia is particularly well placed for a variety of reasons. I would be far more critical about accepting the status quo within ASEAN. It is very dangerous, for example, to simply accept that Singapore should be our financial hub. In a situation where Singapore serves as the #1 tax haven, not only in Southeast Asia, in the world. I still remember about 8 years ago, some Africans writing in the Financial Times of London, complaining about how the focus has always been on Switzerland, but nobody talks about Singapore, where a lot of countries, a lot of people with a lot of money, often dirty money, come there and do some money laundering, and they pay much less tax than anybody else, all in the name of, active neutrality. Now, I don't want you to ask Chin Tong to. He's a official of the government, and he's not in a position to say this, But I can say this, and I think it's very important. I'm not saying that therefore we go to war with Singapore. Okay, that's not the point. You live in a world where there will be a lot of differences, but let's be real. Okay, everybody complains about the virtual monopoly Grab has. Well, what has Grab done? They have basically, with the help from the Malaysian government, been able to secure a virtual monopoly in this country, and now they have transformed themselves from being what was once a ride-hailing company into a financial conglomerate, okay, with a ride-hailing base, okay. Now, if you think that you need to go to a fancy business school and pay millions to go to a fancy business school, well, I think you're sadly wrong. A lot of other people could do that. And if you think about some of the other ride-hailing initiatives which have happened in the world, you don't need a fancy. But whatever the case might be, the fact of the matter is that you have a situation where we need to be very, very realistic and pragmatic going forward. So we have a situation where we know that there are many opportunities which are there, but also many opportunities which are lost. Let's not forget that before the recent turn of events, and I don't think we should start with Trump, because it really starts with Obama and Mrs. Clinton declaring the pivot to Asia. Okay, the isolation, the turning to Asia and making Asia, and particularly the South China Sea, an area of contestation. But China has not been wonderful either. China, for example, it talks about the rule of law, but it doesn't want to deal with the law of the sea and ignore the decision favoring the Filipino government. So I think we have a very complex world, and we have very pragmatic reasons for not joining any camp, but moving forward in a pragmatic fashion. And I think Dr. Munirah's reminder to us that that there are many ways of looking at international relations. There are many ways of looking at many things, and we should not be bound by one or the other. There's no reason to be wedded to an idea which Mr. Fukuyama came up with, more than 3 decades ago, or for that matter, his former teacher, Samuel Huntington, you know, in a kind of childish way, coming up with the idea of a clash of civilizations. I mean, that's equally stupid in my view, but let's not get into all that now because it'll take a lot, it'll distract us from the issues at stake. So we need to have a situation where we have essentially, you know, there was a moment, undoubtedly, where there was a unipolar world after the collapse of the Soviet Union, etc. But now we have increasingly a multipolar world. A multipolar world where we have to constantly be agile in shifting and moving to position ourselves for various opportunities. We are not, you know, we have to be proactive. We should be agents of our own interests rather than simply like a billiard ball or what do you call those machines where you try to move the ball around?
Pinball.
A pinball. You know, we shouldn't be that. You know, we should be agents. We have agency, and this is something which is important. We should recognize this, and there are very important examples. If we think, for example, about the Prime Minister's appeal to Madani, the example of Medina is very important. In Medina, at the time of the Prophet of Islam, may peace be upon him, you have a situation where you had a multicultural, a multi-religious community. Okay, you could fight, or you could choose to work with the other communities, with Christians, with Jews, etc. And that was what was done in Medina. So the choice of Medina becomes very important, and the rejection of something which you know has been wrongly understood by people who read Khaldun. But the whole idea of Asabiya, there's an element of social solidarity, but there's also an element of tribalism, okay? And the rejection of that in favor of finding common humanity. If you read the Quran, for example, you will find that that at times it is the Muslims who are being addressed, and there are times when all of humanity is being addressed. And the responsibility of being Khalifa Allah, vicegerents, is all, for all, okay? So I think we need to really begin to think of it. If you think about, you know, I mean, I'm sitting here on, you know, the children of very eminent scholars. If you think about Malacca in, you know, the period of Malacca's glory, do you know how many ministers replacing Liew Chin Tong there were in Malacca? Did we have one Shah Banda? Did we have two Shah Banda? We had 4 Shah Banda. There was a Javanese guy who was in charge of the Nusantara. There was a Chinese guy, a Hokkien guy, who was in charge of East Asia. There was initially a Bengali and later a Tamil guy who was handling the Bay of Bengal and so on. And then there was a Gujarati guy who was handling points west. You know, this was the kind of pragmatism which that made Malacca glorious. Okay, now where does all this fit into, you know, this kind of the kind of views of the world, reductionist views which Dr. Munirah was criticizing? So I think it's very important for us to in a sense, you know, take all this big grand theories with a pinch of salt and really look at history, look at facts, look at context, and to chart our work accordingly. But for that, we need to be able to critically look at received wisdom, you know, people who define our problems for us, you know.
I'd like to jump in there. I guess I'll have one more question and then we'll open the floor up to Q&As, so get your questions ready. But jumping off of what Professor Jomo was just saying about multiculturalism, multipolarism, Eden, is there common themes or common values that we can all agree on regionally or as a people or as a society that can inform how we move forward as a regional bloc?
Okay. Iqbal, I will state from the outset that I absolutely loathe this term values. And we were having a discussion earlier, and so much of the dominance of what we would call the Western world, or those hegemonic powers, is located in a very Manichean view of the world. Good and bad, good and evil, the morality. That's being played out in the horrific theater of Gaza today, right? Where we are just looking essentially for who to blame. And we're pointing to October 7th or whatever it is as the start of all this, when, there's such a historical and such a subliminal story to this entire grotesquerie going on there at the moment. But we're reducing it to that. Who started it first? And as I said, a crusader view of the world, which we've never left actually, would take that into account. I'm very glad that Prof raised the issue of we live in a complex world. And I think one aspect that I've not spoken about at all is culture. Again, I also agree with a lot of what YB said when we don't compare with ourselves with it. But what is striking me about countries like Indonesia is inventiveness. Yeah, it's inventiveness. I think we do not inform so much of our discussions from our own lived cultural experience. I love the reference of Malacca, and even the terms we use to describe our territory, not just Malaysia, but the Southeast Asian territory. Even the terms are borrowed from sociology, and I work a great deal in culture. I'm trying to find a good scholarly word for bastard. We are a bastard region in the sense that we're so culturally wild, and the flows of communities and influences are so deep that, a term like pluralist doesn't work. A term like multicultural doesn't work. It's so much more ingrained. So I think part of the problem of Southeast Asians is that we shoot ourselves in the kneecap all the time. That was a famous tactic by the Irish Republican Army. Whenever they found an informant, they'd shoot you in the kneecap so that you hobbled in a certain way and people would know you were an informant. We seem to be doing that to ourselves all the time, denying our wildness and our bastardy, really. I'll find a better word for that one of these days that seems a little more acceptable. I use that word because when I was growing up as a mixed child, that's what I was called all the time. And I've come to love the term, like James Baldwin. You come to own the term that that used against you. But these questions of inventiveness, you referred to Malacca. Let me refer to something a little more maybe close to our heart. Jalan Ampas in Singapore, and the beginnings of the Malay film industry with your Chinese financiers and Indian filmmakers and great Malay bangsawan actors whose bus boys or bag carriers in those days were Hakka men. It was a Hakka man who did all the banking for P. Ramlee because he didn't know how to handle money, right? And it's this kind, and Indian directors, interesting scripts. I once interviewed a great actor who in the end lived his life in such poverty, it was heartbreaking. His name was Mahmood June. Mahmood June was one of our great bangsawan actors, later made it into the film industry. And he did this great, he did the first adaptation of Hamlet onto the bangsawan stage, right? And I asked him, Pak Mahmood, when did you read Hamlet and in what language? He said, no, I never read the play. I just heard somebody talking about it. And then they told me the story, so I adapted it for the bangsawan stage. And it was a complete classic. That kind of improvisatory capacity that even a state like, polity like Malacca had, so that it became the envy of the rest of the world. I think that a lot of that is encapsulated in the ideals we have now. I'm also very serious about Madani. I think it's a very, very serious concept. But I am a little dismayed at how little there is a consultative aspect to it, right? A Medina, the concept of the Medina, my second home is Morocco, so I understand what a Medina is, and not just as a lived experience, but also conceptually what it means. And we are not serving ourselves well. But I think inventiveness is very important. And just to close, talking about values and all this, again, a term I really loathe because it's really not ours. And it imposes very kind of clerical things on us. I've been doing a lot of work at the moment on Gandhi. Gandhi is no saint. Anyone who reads his autobiography will find a really tortured soul who was a bit of a crackpot and an eccentric. But Gandhi, I think, poses something very important to us today. Many of his views were quite extreme, you know, anarchist views and things of small communal living. But I think there's a lot there for us, particularly in the tropics, to think about. I work in many rural communities in Malaysia, looking at culture in Kelantan, in Kedah, in Perlis. So much of the poverty, and there's a lot of poverty, somehow less in Kelantan and really bad in Kedah for some reason. And I look at those territories and I say, you know, it's really a lack of any kind of imaginative planning. And I'll give you a good example. Tobacco farmers in Kelantan. Since the closure of British American tobacco, since the closure of Philip Morris, you know, don't supply tobacco to these big conglomerates anymore. So they don't know what to do with their products because they don't know how to diversify their crops. This is happening a great deal in Indonesia, where of course the main supply is still to tobacco, but Indonesia is supplying great amounts of tobacco for perfumery, for pharmaceuticals, and our farmers just don't have access to that kind of knowledge and inventiveness. A great challenge for Malaysia, apart from, you know, there is the hard economy aspect and there is industrialization, which we cannot deny. But there's no development of the soft economy sector, which Indonesia, for example, places as one of its top 10 priorities in 2050, the cultural economy. Our cultural economy is a farce. It's a complete farce. So I think we need that kind of depth. And I think that's also how we interact with the rest of the ASEAN countries, because I think the problem with regionalism today, and we see that in the European Union a great deal, is that national self-interest eventually comes into conflict with regional interest. And then you enter situations like Brexit, which, you know, there's no practical solution because it has become a subliminal issue. We hate foreigners, basically, is what so much of it revolves around now. So I think many of these questions need to be interrogated very deeply, and we are in that place now, where there still exists a bipolar, you know, unipolar world, but it's changing a great deal, and I think we need to position ourselves very carefully, very cautiously, but very intelligently, but informing that conversation with our own lived experience as a community and a society, which is what we are not doing, because we don't know and don't remember.
Thank you, Edin. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll start taking Q&As. We are pretty short on time, but we'll get through as many as we can. I see hands. I will start with that gentleman over there. Can you introduce your first name and... Great, thank you, Shazwan. Do we have further questions from the floor? This lady at the front. Yeah, just introduce your first name and shout the question out. Great. Maybe one last
Sorry,
from
can I
that side.
just quickly interrupt? Please make sure that your mic is muted unless the moderator cue you, because there's only limited slot for the mic. Because I've seen some mic on your armrest that is still lit up. So make sure that it is muted unless the moderator asks you to pose a question. Thank you so much.
This gentleman in the front.
Okay. All right. Sorry. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and hi, I'm Shamsho from IUM. A simple question really. Just now we talked about, Dr. Liew Chin Tong talked about the active neutrality, and also Dr. Jomo talked about pragmatism and so on. But I think what ASEAN is lack of is that we often think about regional against the national self-interest, and in the end, it seems that we are weak. So the Western powers, or even China, dares to cross our South China Sea and so on, because we tend to take care of our national self-interest. First question is that, how should ASEAN go forward? Should we just take care of our national self-interest, or should we enhance our regional self-interest with proactive measures, not reactive measures? And the second thing is how we could enhance our economic acumen, whether it should be like a European Union model, or it should be like we focus on Singapore as our financial hub, or Malaysia to enhance our SMEs. So how should we focus on? Thank you very much.
Great. The latter two questioners had more than one question, but I think we'll start with the question by Shazwan. It was really simple, I guess. What can these group of folks walk out here today with? How can this inform their future roles as decision makers, given the changing world? Professor Jomo, you can go first.
Well, I'm not sure. Let me try to deal with. There are too many questions which require long answers, but let me just focus on one or two very simple and pragmatic things. I think most policymakers in this country and most people engaged in policy debate don't know our country well enough. They don't know the history of the country. They don't know the context well enough. So they don't build on things which already exist. Look at the academics in a field which I'm interested in, industrialization. If you look at you'll find that everybody talks about how wonderful our achievements in E&E, electronics and electrical industry was during the late 20th century. But when you really look at it, what is it? It's foreign companies locating in Malaysia, using Malaysian workers, making money. We give them all kinds of tax breaks, so we don't even collect taxes. We give them subsidies through subsidized electricity, etc., infrastructure and so on. So basically, we created a lot of jobs, and it was quite an important thing because there were almost 400,000 women who went into the labor force during the 1970s and 1980s. A very, very significant achievement. There were more women in manufacturing than even men at one time. mainly in electronics as well as in, what do you call it, garments. But if you think about it, what is the real achievement as far as Malaysian industrialization is concerned? It's something which almost nobody talks about, namely the refining of palm oil. Malaysia, within a space of 10 years, became the most efficient refiner of palm oil in the world. But that was 40 years ago. Today, what is the challenge? Today, many people in the world are concerned about biofuels, interested in biofuels, and we have the possibility, not in the world, yeah, of becoming the most efficient biofuel producer. Because Europe has chosen biodiesel, Americans chose bioethanol, and as Brazilians will complain, the bioethanol is heavily subsidized in the US. In Europe as well, the biodiesel is subsidized. But the cheapest form of vegetable oils for biodiesel would actually be from palm oil, which the European protectionists have basically blocked out. Okay? So, you know, since the 1980s, people like Tan Sri Augustine Ong and Tan Sri Yusof Basiron have been talking about the potential of biodiesel. How much support was there? Next to zero. Next to zero beyond the normal budget of PORIM, and after them, there was no sustained effort. So today, who is leading the work on palm oil-based biodiesel? It is Indonesia. Indonesia has developed a dwarf oil palm tree, where the tree will not grow very tall, because in Malaysia, we cut down our oil palm trees after they reach the age of about 25, because they're getting too tall. So, you know, the radical changes are happening in Indonesia. And who are these scientists? Many of them are actually Malaysian scientists who no longer work for the Malaysian oil plantation companies. So we are in a situation where we do not value what we have. We do not make full use of what we have. In the 1990s, I learned about the possibility of photovoltaic solar panels. Malaysia now is the #2 producer of photovoltaic solar panels. China is #1 with 71%. Malaysia and South Korea are #2 with about 7+%. How many solar panels are used in Malaysia? A few. But the solar panels are not widely used and are not being promoted. There are more promotion of solar panels by Petronas in Vietnam than in Malaysia.
On that note, as illuminating as that is, I would like to say that we've run out of time. So I think I would just like to give a final 30 seconds to each of you to just wrap up. What do you think, how do you think everyone here should think about this topic going forward into the future? Maybe we can start with Eden.
Well, my thinking is basically, you know, always about inventiveness, about thinking in different ways. But it requires a great deal. So I don't know. I think my thing, you know, words I said. I think sometimes we are also very, very trapped, snared in certain kinds of language and terminology. You know, leadership. You know, what kind of leadership? What kind of things like that that are very kind of motivational speaker kind of driven. So I don't know. I always just think, you know, that's why I mentioned Gandhi, because I think he really represented an alternative, trying to create an alternative for which we all laughed at him at that time. But maybe it resonates again today. But that alternative must come from our own experience, and it has to be worldly. You know, it just can't be theories and things. But that's where history, I think, and culture plays a very important role. I don't know how relevant that is to young people. That's always my concern.
Thank you, Eden. Dr. Munirah?
Hello, yes. Okay, my last words. Basically, I know you're all young. Some of you are still in university. Some of you have just graduated. But my last words about how we can move forward is, first of all, education is very important. Learn how to ask what and why and what if questions. Our education system does not encourage that. Now, I'm very, very critical of our school and university system because of this very problem. Now, in IR, we talk about IR as international relations. But ask yourself, is it really international? Is the current world order really international? It claims to be international, but the focus is basically how a superpower views the rest, how the US views the rest. Again, this us versus them. And what I am advocating is for us to develop our own self-confidence by having different views, by not simply accepting the theories that are fed to you. The theories, just because they are written in Western textbooks, we translate them or we drop Western names or developed world names and apply it. Develop your own questions. Develop your questions and your theorizing based on your lived experience.
I think that's a good way to put it for everyone. Chin Tong?
Yeah, I'll try to answer the questions of industry and also the future of the economy. The Prime Minister launched the new Industrial Master Plan on 1st of September. We have taken a new approach. We have taken a mission-based approach, and there are 4 missions. The first mission is to increase the complexity of our economy. We want to do value adding. We do not just want to do the low-end work. Secondly, tech up. We want to digitalize, we want to automate, we want to use a lot more technology, and we want to innovate. Thirdly, we want to deal with climate change, push for net zero. Number 4, we want to deal with the question of security, economic security and economic inclusivity, so that industrialization generate jobs, industrialization generate better economic prospects for ordinary Malaysians. I see 6 growth engines that will take Malaysia to a second economic takeoff. The first one, reindustrialization. As I explained, we have experienced a long period of premature deindustrialization. This is a time I think we can turn it around. Secondly, green transition. Professor Jomo pointed out about the question about solar. We will have to do green transition partly because we have to deal with subsidy, subsidy cut. Using that as an opportunity to do green transition so that a lot more people are using solar and not just using electricity. A lot more people are using EV rather than using ICE car. Thirdly, tech up, as I mentioned earlier, technology, automation, for creating better life. And that is also a potential areas where we can rethink of a lot of issues, how to do housing better, differently, how to do healthcare differently, and the rest. Number 5, thinking about regions in a different way. See, we are very concentrated in Kuala Lumpur and the Klang Valley, but there's so much potential in the northern side, there's so much potential in the southern side, there's so much potentials in the regions, and that is also an engine of growth. And we will have to finally talk about job-led consumption. At the moment, especially over the last 10, 15 years, we have been very dependent on debt-fueled private consumption. We're buying electric appliances with debts. I mean, that is a long-term time bomb. We need to pay our people better so that they consume not through debt, but actually consume through job-led growth. Now, these are the growth engines that I think will take Malaysia to a second economic takeoff, and that I think is for your generations to take it up. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please help me give a warm round of applause to our speakers for today. I will hand it back over to the MC to take it from here.
Thank you, Iqbal, and all our panelists up on stage. Kindly remain on stage as we will proceed with the presentation of token of appreciation.
We would like to invite the Deputy Director of the Youth Economic Forum 2023, Ms. Sharifah Munirah, to present the tokens of appreciations to our speakers and moderators. Can we invite all of our speakers and our moderator to kindly come to the front of the stage so that we can do a quick photograph as well.
We would like to thank Yang Berhormat Tuan Liew Chin Tong.
A round of applause, please. Followed by Professor Dr. Jomo Kwame Sundaram.
Next, Dr. Sharifah Munirah Alatas.
Followed by Mr. Edin Koo.
Last but